Welcome to Game Data. This week, we're taking a step back from the shiny gadgets of today to look at a phone that came and went maybe a little too fast. I'm talking about the ZTE Axon M. Now, on the surface, it looks like your standard smartphone of a certain year with sharp, flat edges and a reasonably large screen, but in actuality, it's like very few phones out there except the Surface Duo. That's right. This dual screen phone predates the Duo line by a few years, and in many ways shows how dual screen phones and foldables in general have improved since they first started to hit the market. It's also a testament to how cool modern devices can be, even if not made by the largest phone makers like Samsung or Huawei. In this video, we'll take a deeper look into how this phone got a ton right and is probably a worthwhile device for anyone interested in the timeline of foldable and dual screen phones, even if it ultimately faded into obscurity not long after it came out. Just a note though, before we continue, my device came used from eBay for a price typically reserved for devices with busted screens. As you can probably see on close-ups, there's more than a few scrapes and bumps. It's still perfectly functional though, just don't mind the wear and tear in those close-up shots. It's coming loose a bit, yet still feels surprisingly solid, which might be a good sign for anyone looking to grab one of these while functional units are still available on the market. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's get started. First, some general background. Second screen devices have actually been around for multiple decades now. From the OG flip phones with their external notification screens to the Galaxy Z Fold 3 with its outer display. There's been a rich history of smartphone manufacturers recognizing that a secondary display can be quicker to use than the main display, or at least provide some sort of ergonomic benefit over the main display. Manufacturers like LG had even taken it a step further by creating an external display attachment for some of their later devices for use alongside that larger display. Or, as in the case of HP, docks to transform their phones even further into laptops or basic PCs. Those secondary screens, even in LG's case, are fairly optional to use though, and aren't necessarily required to use the phone in its full glory. By contrast, a few manufacturers have gone a step even further with true dual screen devices, which are a bit different in that their second screens aren't detachable and are largely required to use the device effectively. We've seen only a handful of these devices over the years, namely the Kyocera Echo, ZTE Axon M, LG Wing, and Surface Duo line. Each iteration improves upon the last in some way, and generally becomes more compelling for daily use with each iteration, with the Echo being panned as essentially a gimmick, and the Duo 2, from personal experience, being one of the best handheld productivity devices on the market. The Axon M slots somewhere in between those two extremes. To get a sense for why that is, we really only need to look at the phone. In many ways, ZTE's overall design choices mirror those of the first non-Samsung foldable phones we saw a few years back. By adopting an outer fold, the Axon M is able to hide its hinge while using both screens and cut down on that gap between both screens. It's an interesting take, which also necessitates some sharp edges so that the two screens are flush when open. Plus, because the second screen needs to dock into the first when closed to lay flat, ZTE opted for a more durable backing, which even has a user-accessible battery compartment. Honestly, they're minor details, but really boost my appreciation for the device. Not just because of aesthetics, but also for the general longevity of the device itself. A visible hinge gap really stunts the immersion of the Duo 2's otherwise lovely displays. And getting rid of that and reducing some space between screens would really help immensely without succumbing to using more fragile folding screens. Not to mention, when's the last time you owned a phone where you could easily swap out the battery without a heat gun? Those sorts of devices are a dying breed as companies have begun adding glass backs to their phones for both aesthetics and wireless charging. The Axon M doesn't really need more glass though. The hefty, mostly metal design feels extremely solid and purposeful. While certain phones feel as if they were designed to be as light as possible, it really seemed like ZTE realized they couldn't avoid extra weight from the second screen and really leaned into it as much as possible. That premium feel is at least backed by the usability options available. The headphone jack inclusion here is very much welcome, as is the microSD card slot. While I've grown to be less dependent upon the 3.5mm port to listen to music, being able to expand the paltry 64GB of onboard memory means a lot for a device which I'm primarily going to use for emulation these days. Of course, that's where the second screen also comes in. Both screens have a 1080 by 920 resolution with fairly standard 16 by 9 aspect ratios. While not as ideal for emulating older consoles, this does mean fewer sizing issues for more standard apps. As someone who uses both a Fold 3 and Duo 2 daily, I'm well aware of some apps just not wanting to resize correctly to fit taller or boxier screens. Given that the Axon M is basically a regular ZTE phone with another ZTE phone bolted onto it, resizing is very much not an issue and might actually be a decent approach for anyone who wants a dual screen experience without an adjustment period to a brand new screen type. The same goes for actually using that second screen. All dual screen actions are controlled manually with a fourth navigation button and largely mirror the project options from a Windows computer. You can turn off one screen to use it as a stand. You can mirror screens to watch a video alongside someone else. You can separate the screens to use two separate apps at the same time, even when folded like a tent. And of course, you can span one app across both screens to mimic a small tablet experience. Of the different options, screen mirroring is probably the least useful option. Outside of a circumstance like trying to watch a video with someone else while traveling and sitting across from them on a table, there's not much reason to use it. Even then, it's still pretty awkward, though I do give ZTE credit for at least managing to handle rotation for each screen independently, meaning that the video orientation always looks right. Manually turning off a screen is also pretty limited to just using one screen as a stand. Now, don't get me wrong, ever since my days rocking an HTC Evo 4G, I love a good kickstand on a phone. It's just that there's very little use for turning off the screen outside of that specific scenario, and taking a picture with the device's single camera, which is still perfectly usable, by the way, for the average person. If you hated the camera implementation on the Surface Duo 1, you still might not appreciate this implementation too much. Although, on paper, this 20 megapixel camera is technically more resolute than the Duo's 11 megapixel shooter, even while being a couple years older. But really though, the main reason for these two screens is to either open two apps at once or one app really large. I'm actually surprised at how well both these features work. For context, the Surface Duo 1 running Android 10 felt every bit like a first generation device, with more than a few bugs to stunt much of its widespread appeal. Well, at full price anyways. The Axon M is stuck on Android 7 with only the tacked on features created by ZTE to make the dual screens function with any kind of fluidity. You think ZTE would be at a disadvantage here, but their manual method of switching screen behavior kills more than a few of the bugs that originally made the Surface Duo 1 feel a little awkward. That might be because gesture controls are just more finicky overall, and removing them reduces potential problems. But it could also be that ZTE just had to try less to monitor how the screens behave. After all, their screens appear to be treated as two separate displays, rather than the Duo's one large display that's virtually sectioned off into two windows. Beyond potentially less processing being needed to organize the video feed, this can actually be both an overall benefit and a disadvantage for actual content consumption depending on the use case. For example, viewing an image that spans both screens on the Duo hides the pixels where the hinge is located, whereas the Axon M splits the image to render each half on its respective screen. Personally, I prefer the Duo's method, since good continuity makes the cutoff image look fairly natural, while the Axon M's method makes the image look like a spacer was jammed into the center of the image. I don't think there's really a correct opinion here though, since text doesn't weirdly get cut off if all the pixels are being displayed. Plus, that spacer may make screen arrangement easier for certain apps, like the fact that Android games are technically more playable here since there's less chance of any details getting cut off. However, that doesn't mean that this is magically a dual screen device that you can flawlessly play all Android games on while spanned. While you might get used to it after a while, it's still a bit awkward to look at. Think of it sort of like connecting monitors to your desktop computer. With Duos, that monitor is an ultra-wide with a black bar running down the middle to digitally separate screens, while the Axon M is like two individual monitors sitting side by side. In both cases, watching a video across the full screen is awkward, but in the case of the side-by-side monitors, there's an extra degree of separation between the video feeds. Combine that with a tense firefight or race, and you're bound to just want to switch back to a single screen. Again, that's a bit easier to do here due to more conventional aspect ratio, but there are many newer, cheaper phones that'd likely be a better experience. And oh yeah, emulation is fairly nifty on this device too. Well, when the apps behave at least. By default, certain apps just aren't compatible with the spanned mode resizing. That's immediately troublesome if you're actually wanting to use the second screen as a controller. Luckily, ZTE included a toggle to force apps to open spanned, kinda like what Samsung and Microsoft have done with their latest devices. This may not always be a magic bullet, but it works an overwhelmingly majority of the time, and is a really nice touch for usability. For actual gameplay though, dual screens mean that DS emulation feels a bit more natural. Likewise, for single screen systems, the two screens means more comfortable touch controls without blocking the game with your hands. The fact that the second screen is also a bit thinner also leaves a nice little cleft to rest my fingers on while playing. It's a small detail, but it's sorely missed on some newer foldables. Just don't expect miracles with performance on this aging chipset. The Snapdragon 821 was decent for its time, but can't make up for the need for more powerful CPUs and GPUs over the years. GameCube and 3DS games are gonna be fairly sluggish here. Certain less powerful games may be playable, but my go-to test runs of Mario Kart Double Dash and Super Mario 3D Land didn't fare so well. As a result, I've leaned more so on older consoles with my gameplay sessions for decent experiences. That's not entirely terrible though, considering the onboard storage is small and would require an extra microSD card to hold a bunch of newer, larger games. Not to mention the fact that touch-based shoulder and trigger buttons are always kind of awkward on this longer form factor. And it's also kind of awkward to attach external controllers to just a unique form factor like this, without resulting to using one screen as a kickstand. Those are largely minor complaints though, from a device that's otherwise oddly comfortable to use and hold for long periods of emulation. I don't necessarily enjoy the wider screen than, say, the Surface Duo for DS emulation, since the screen height constrains how tall the virtual screens can be. For single screen consoles though, that extra width feels really comfortable with the extra space allowed for my hands, but also means larger black bars. You know, it's really a story of compromises here. Everything feels good enough, and in the landscape of 2017, I definitely like this better than the LG G5 I was using. There's just a lot of small comforts here that add up to a neat, though imperfect gaming experience. Honestly, I could probably go on and on about why I think this device is pretty nifty. Beyond gaming, the Axon M was basically the only non-Samsung phone at the time to offer reliable split-screen apps. If you wanted to be productive on a phone, you could do so much worse than this phone when it came out. So why did it fade away into obscurity? Well, multiple reasons. As we saw with the Duo 1, general consumers have a hard time seeing dual screens as a meaningful feature, at least until they've imagined some clear use case for it. When provided an option, most people are going to be comfortable sticking to form factors that they know. And I can't really blame them, considering the large investment that smartphones have become. Not to mention, we only just started to see the first dregs of dual and foldable screen software support in Android 11. There's no way that didn't limit ZTE's overall options for showing off the full effectiveness of their device. If you couldn't tell already, the Axon M also isn't the pinnacle of dual screen design. The hinge is fairly basic overall, and it's wearing down quite a bit after all these years. All controls are also forced to the left side of the device, which really messes with muscle memory for things like where the power button should be. The outer fold also means that closing the device always leaves at least one screen in direct contact with a hand or table. That increases smudges, for sure, and, well, glass is glass, and glass breaks. It's really no wonder why I see a ton of eBay listings for Axon Ms as having busted screens. It really needed a couple more versions to really nail the final details. However, there's also the fact that ZTE's been blacklisted by the US government for violating US trade sanctions and suspicion of spying for the Chinese government. Prior to being blacklisted, ZTE wasn't necessarily the biggest name in the US, but it effectively stopped them from expanding further into the US market and made doing business with US partners just a tad bit more difficult. In situations like that, it's no wonder why they didn't double down on an admittedly experimental design like the Axon M. Though, if their marketing is to be believed, they had some fairly high hopes for the Axon M being the next big form factor shift the market should really buy into. And that's all pretty unfortunate. Without additional iterations, it just kinda stuck in time. Limited by the constraints of aging hardware and software due to a lack of further updates. Though, as we've seen, there are a lot of cool points here, and more than a bit of potential with its more conventional design beats, straightforward dual screen support, and generally good usability. I can only recommend seeking out one of these phones over something like a Duo if you're a smartphone collector. But the next time you think about foldables, it might be worthwhile to consider how the Axon M was a few years ahead of its time and seemed to really home in on what was needed to make this form factor work in the first place. Without it laying the foundation, it's possible these newer devices would look a bit different today. What are your thoughts on the Axon M though? Do you wish we had more dual screen phones on the market? Is there anything about the phone you'd like more info on? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you found this video interesting or informative, feel free to hit that like button and get subscribed for similar videos in the future. We have a variety of cool gadgets currently sitting on my desk, but you can always go back and check out my Duo 2 review for more dual screen goodness. That's all for now though. Until next time, catch you later.